Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Casual Audio Papers with Xeilias Canani. Now, let us get back to where we were. Here we go. In this episode, this is actually a pretty short paper sort of thing. I don't know if you would call it a paper, but it's part of this book that you can, I guess, just look at, which is really interesting. You have this essay that we're going to be going over right here, but you can also just like scroll up and view something like this: the case for discipline-specific differentiation in academic promotion in Hungarian higher education. Or scroll up some more and read this essay. And so apparently this is like all of these are just free. All of them. So that's really cool. I would recommend, if you're really interested in this sort of stuff, you can take a look at this. This is just what is found on this bundles page. Which one is it? The one with the strange last name? This one. The future of education is science. Neuroscience. Okay. Introduction. In some circumstances, our level of understanding nature is still in the 10th century, observes Richard Conn Henry, professor at the Johns Hopkins University, USA. 1,000 years ago, Ibn al-Haytham, stated that light comes from a source, travels inside the eye, and is perceived. This theory is still what most people think about vision. Just try to ask a common scientific question to common people on the street. People virtually licensed in something after spending at least 10 years in school. Which is the reason why education, that is supposed to be a science, is so far from science. More than 100 years passed since the theory of quantum mechanics was formulated, and we still think and teach in Cartesian terms. We still think that knowledge is the sum of the information we have. We still consider ourselves like bags filled with weird things that bear sophisticated names. The world is quantum mechanical. We must learn to perceive it as such, says Richard Conn Henry, because, quote, one benefit of switching humanity to a correct perception of the world is the resulting joy of discovering the mental nature of universe, end quote. That was an interesting introduction, I think. I'm not entirely sure how quantum mechanics affects our understanding of neuroscience. That would be really interesting to get into. Methodology. The practical aspects of data collection, analysis, interpretation, and the management of large data sets are considered in order to adopting of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, positron emission tomography, PET, and single photon emission computed tomography, SPECT, into a new science of education. Psychological functions have been assigned to certain brain areas using electroencephalography, EEG, electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, MEG, PET, or fMRI. There are no inactive areas in the brain. Even asleep, no brain area is completely inactive. fMRI uses BOLD, blood oxygen level dependent, contrast to map neural activity in the sensory regions of the brain and even its cognitive functions. fMRI relies on the paramagnetic properties of the more or less oxygenated hemoglobin to offer images of the blood flow in the brain, a flow that varies with the activation of the neurons. PET uses a radio tracer, a radio-labeled compound, which is injected into the bloodstream. Sensors in the PET scanner detect its radioactivity and the emissions of the radio tracer are processed by a computer to produce 2 or 3-dimensional images. The most common radio tracer is a labeled form of glucose. Glucose is the best fuel for the brain. Hence, when a specific cerebral region becomes active, it requires more glucose. SPECT is similar to PET. It uses gamma-ray emitting radioisotopes. A radioactive tracer, SPECT agent, is injected into the bloodstream. A gamma camera records data, and a computer produces 2 or 3-dimensional images of the brain regions which are active. Compared to PET or fMRI, SPECT offers a snapshot of the cerebral flow, but a poor resolution. The images acquired during a neuroimaging session are then interactively post-processed to produce an activation map. This map may be interpreted by clinicians. The neuroimaging methods could be a valuable tool in the process of understanding the cortical processes that undergo learning. A neuroscience of education. The idea of connecting cognitive neuroscience and teacher education is not new, but a forgotten one. The idea of neuroeducators was proposed in the 80s, when the study of brain/behavior was considered a way to enhance the pedagogical practice. So that would actually be the behaviorists, who were the more hard science-based practitioners within psychology throughout the first half of psychological research, as opposed to the cognitive scientists, who were a bit more metaphysical, and the psychoanalysts. The neurologists and behaviorists were sort of on the harder science side, and the cognitionists and psychoanalysts were on the softer science side. But, of course, when we get to cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, it combines both of those sides into a more robust, holistic view, and then you get cognitive neuroscience, which is a similar practice of combining that spectrum. To connect classroom experience and cognitive neuroscience, transdisciplinary, holistic approach is needed. Lately, Mind, Brain, and Education, MBE, has become an option. I would take a step forward in order to study the influence of the hormones during the development of the human being as a whole, not only as a brain. The recent advances in neuroscience and the educational research may work together. A neuroscientific perspective adds a new dimension to the study of learning, and educational knowledge could direct the neuroscience research towards relevant areas. Researchers and trainers can work together to identify educationally relevant research goals and discuss potential implications of research results. Educational neuroscience is necessary for defining a real learning science. An effective education system has to address each individual, not only groups, and to take into account the different brain structures. In order to do this, there are some so-called neuromyths that have to be debunked. 1. People are either right or left-brained. Hence, people are either logical or creative. This is the most common neuromyth. What means logical or creative, though? How do you measure creativity? If we discuss about math skills, the theory of education says that the left hemisphere, the logic one, will deal with it. But there are different kinds of math skills, and the ability to deal with numbers comes from processing that undergoes in both hemispheres. The left hemisphere seem to be more involved in counting and reciting multiplication tables, which rely on memorized verbal information, which is considered as logical. And the right hemisphere is better in estimating. Both hemispheres make critical contributions for most of cognitive skills. It takes two hemispheres to be logical/creative. 2. The first 3 years of a child are decisive for later development and success in life, because the brain is only plastic for certain kinds of information during specific critical periods. This idea originated from studies of animal behavior, like Konrad Lorenz's critical period of imprinting in birds, but the critical periods are not so sharply delineated and are influenced by many factors. A large body of research in vision, audition, and language show that different brain systems display very different amounts and types of changes with experience. A quality named plasticity, the capacity to form synapses. Some systems keep changing with experience throughout life, whilst the ability to learn the sounds and the grammar of a language appears to be optimal in the early and middle childhood years. But plasticity is not limited to the first 3 years of life. Any kind of stimulation induces new connections between neurons, and this ability is conserved throughout whole life. 3. Enriched environments enhance the brain's capacity for learning. Hence, one of the theories of education states that if a child has not been fully exposed to an enriched environment, it will not recover later on in life, and his capacities that could be accomplished early in life are lost. The idea comes from a research on rats. Those raised in an enriched and stimulating environment could solve and learn complex maze problems compared to rats raised in a deprived environment, which never recovered from moving them in an enriched environment. Human brain shows plasticity throughout the whole life and is not limited to enriched environment phase during the first 3 years of life. The concept of enriched environment is, by the way, arguable as long as the beings, human or not, fully develop in their natural environment. This is a full body of research in the field of animal cognition, which shows that animals can learn to talk in human language if necessary. There's no citation for that, of course, because when you get really interesting statements, it's like that. You don't want to cite your sources. Geez, maybe it is in here. No, it's not. Wow. Okay, well, I would want to take a look at that because that sounds really interesting. 4. There is a visual, auditive, and a haptic type of learning. This is the type of learner theory and was formulated by Frederick Vester in his book Thinking, Learning, Forgetting, first printed in 1975. This theory states that learning occurs through different channels. Sorry about that, my mic just stopped working. So, I'm going to start back on the beginning of 4. 4. There is a visual, auditive, and haptic type of learning. This is the type of learner theory and was formulated by Frederick Vester in his book Thinking, Learning, Forgetting, first printed in 1975. This theory states that learning occurs through different channels of perception, and the type of learner, biologically determined, can be characterized by the predominant use of one channel of perception. As scientists stated, a step beyond perception is necessary. The learner needs to process the input of his senses and give this input a meaning, and this is the essential step in understanding and learning. Another Cartesian approach is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Although useful in stimulating people to unpack their gifts, it may block the manifestation of the intelligence itself as a result of the human potential as a whole. 5. We only use 10% of our brain. One of the most stated brain myths is still in use. All existing data show that we use 100% of our brains. There are more than one sources of this myth. The ratio of glia cells to neurons in the brain, it's 10 to 1. The studies of Carl Lashley, who explored at the beginning of the 20th century the function of certain brain areas using electric shocks. Why did they just suddenly switch to Roman numerals? Many brain regions did not react. Hence, he concluded that these regions did not have any function. It seems that Albert Einstein told to a journalist that he only used 10% of his brain as an answer to a question concerning his intelligence, but there is no official record of this statement. 6. Myths about multilingualism. Two languages compete for resources. The more one language is learnt, the more the other language is lost. Knowledge acquired in one language is not accessible in the other language. The two languages lie next to each other in separate brain areas, with no point of contact. Knowledge acquired in one language cannot be transferred to the other language. The first language must be spoken well before the second language is learnt. There are brain areas specialized to deal with language, and which are crucial for performing language tasks, but different parts of both right and left brain hemispheres are active during language production as well. In multilingual individuals, there is a great deal of similarity in the brain areas used for each of the languages they use. Bilinguals monitor continuously their languages in order to avoid unwanted language interferences from the language not in use, and this in turn induces plastic neural effects. This may be the reason why bilinguals are faster than monolinguals on many control tasks that involve attention. That's something that I heard. I was reading this book on bilingualism at one point, and from what I understand from the book, multiple languages can be so closely related that they use the same neurons while speaking them, but depending on how disparate the meaning of a particular word in two languages actually is, the further the neurons seem to be. So, and this would induce a variety of things beyond just the image of meaning in your mind. It might even induce different habits of speak, different induction or intonation in the voice, different ways that you use your hands, like almost entirely different personalities, which can lead to more disparate neurons that are used. But, take for example, apple. Yabloko in Russian and apple in English seem to be pretty much the same thing. They mean the same thing. But if you take something like, let's say, sama as a prefix for a person's name in Japanese, which is used in a wide variety of contexts and is still commonly used today, and like the English equivalent would be like sir or lord or something along those lines, which we almost never use. The meaning would be somewhat more differentiated than yabloko and apple. At least that's from what I understand. I would recommend looking more into that if you're interested. I could be wrong, for instance. Conclusions. The contribution of the neuroscientific community to a better understanding of the human activity of learning for educational purposes is crucial, and it applies for all, gifted or disabled, young or old. These contributions may help for a better understanding of optimal timing for different forms of learning, especially in relation to adolescents and older adults. neurobiological mechanisms which underlie the impact of stress on learning and memory. A specific question concerns the adolescent's emotional brain interactions with different kinds of classroom environments. Mechanisms, nutrition / physical exercise / sleep / art impact on brain development, types of learning and cultural differences. Multi-dimensional pathways to competence in reading, for instance. Mathematics, anxiety, and other barriers human beings raise itself in an educational environment. Different brain activity, neural networks, role of cognitive function, and memory. And these are the references. Oh, that would be an interesting one. Maybe some other time. So yeah, this book here, it seems like a really interesting book. I would be interested to know what the MBE answer to one of the previous papers we read is. Which one is it? The Practical and Principled Problems with Educational Neuroscience. Because, like, I can read papers that continue just to assert those propositions that Mr. Bowers was arguing against, but I do really want to see what somebody who is more familiar on the topic, an expert in the field, has actually said in response to Bowers, because that seems like a very... He had some pretty good rebuttals to MBE in general, which I'm really interested in knowing that. So hopefully one of these next few papers are going to explore that further. Okay, well, this has been a reading of The Future of Education in Science, Neuroscience. Oh, sorry, The Future of Education is Science, Neuroscience by Braescu A. Well, hope you have a good day. And, well, thanks for listening. Bye.